towards you?
Yeah. And I'm gonna, it's for Nate, so they get the sync online.
Oh, okay. You ready? Okay. Yep. Okay, test 1, 2, test 1, 2. Test 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16. 17, 18, 19, 20. Testing. 1, 2. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Good.
Good evening, everyone. Hi. Got a lively bunch. Welcome to the third session of Food Literacy for All. If you're a community member here, how many of you are here for the first time tonight? Could you just raise your hand? Wow, great. Welcome. So for those of you who are new, my name is Jennifer Blesh. I'm a faculty member here in SNRE. Our co-instructor is here in front, Malik Kikini, and he'll introduce our speaker in just a second. Maybe three very quick announcements. You have a kind invitation to everyone. So the local chapter of Slow Food Huron Valley has invited everyone here. If you're interested, this would be a lot of people, but hopefully a subset of you will be interested in occasionally having dinner before class. So at 5 p.m., feel free to go to Silvio's restaurant. And as long as you arrive right at 5, you should have time to have a quick dinner and be well fed before class. So I hope some of you will take up that opportunity for good community and conversation. Some logistical things. You guys, students enrolled in the course, you've done a fabulous job of turning things in on time, but 19 of you have not completed the pre-course evaluation, so please get that done on Canvas. And I still need 6 students to complete the signature line for informed consent for video recording. So do both of those things on Canvas. Katie will send out a reminder email after class. Some of you also need to still register your iClicker. We're having a couple of technical difficulties. If you have any question about how to do that, just email Katie. She'll also send out a reminder about how to do it. One other thing that may be going on, so I'm just going to demonstrate up here. If you have an iClicker, at the start of each session, hold down your power button for a second. These instructions are on the back. And then hit the A twice, and that will get you on the right frequency. So hopefully that'll clear things up, but if you have any questions, chat with Katie. Great, so that's it for my spiel for now, and I'm going to turn it over to Malik.
Good evening, how's everyone doing? So tonight, for the first time, we're live streaming to Detroit, the Detroit Center. So we want to welcome the folks who are joining us from Detroit. So the official Detroit welcome is, what up, doe? Also, for those who are joining from Detroit, if you'd like to ask questions after Dr. Salvador's talk, you can do those via Twitter at #FoodLiteracyForAll. So I am so honored to introduce Ricardo Salvador, who I've known since 2008 or so, and I met him when he was a program officer with the Kellogg Foundation. So I'm going to read his official bio. As the Senior Scientist and Director of the Food and Environment Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists, Ricardo Salvador works with citizens, scientists, economists, and politicians to transition our current food system into one that grows healthy foods while employing sustainable and socially equitable practices. Before coming to the Union of Concerned Scientists, Dr. Salvador served as a program officer for food, health, and well-being at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. In this capacity, he was responsible for conceptualizing and managing the foundation's food systems programming. He partnered with colleagues to create programs that address the connections between food and health, environment, economic development, sovereignty, and social justice. Prior to that, he was an associate professor of agronomy at Iowa State University. While there, he taught the first course in sustainable agriculture at a land-grant university, and his graduate students conducted some of the original academic research on community-supported agriculture. He also worked with students to establish Iowa State University's student-operated organic farm, and with other faculty, he worked to develop the nation's first sustainable agriculture graduate program in 2000. Dr. Salvador served as the program's first chair. He also worked as an extension agent with Texas A&M University. He has appeared on MSNBC Melissa Harris Perry Show and has been quoted in the Boston Globe, the New York Times, Politico, and other outlets. Dr. Salvador was named a 2013 NBC Latino Innovator and received the James Beard Foundation Leadership Award in 2014. He was also an author of a 2014 op-ed in the Washington Post calling for a national food policy, which is changing how many think about food and farm policy. Dr. Salvador earned a BS in agricultural science from New Mexico State University, holds an MS and a PhD in crop production and physiology from Iowa State University. Now, I just want to go off script for a minute and say that, in my opinion, Dr. Salvador is one of the most brilliant, principled, and strategic thinkers that I know. Please give a warm round of applause to Dr. Ricardo Salvador.
We live at a time when we've got our work cut out for us, because I'm assuming that you're here because you're interested in a better food system. And this is a complicated structure to shift. We learned a great deal observing the marches that occurred just a few days ago across the world about a latent power that is out there that hopefully will give us all courage in terms of the size of the job that we need to do. But I want to be really clear about one important point for the entire evening, and that is that even though there are particular challenges that are embodied by the political atmosphere that we're all going to be experiencing over the next 4 years or so, the issues that we contend with are perennial issues. They have been there all along. Some of them may be exacerbated, but these are constants about the food system. That's a key thing that I want to highlight about the system shift that we'll discuss tonight. So just to give you an example of what I mean, let me just give you a recitation of very recent history that is very germane to shifting complicated systems. So I'm going to talk to you about some legal gains that you may think have very little to do with the food system, and I hope that before we spend too much time together this evening, it becomes clear how they are directly related to the food system. So if you think in terms of the long sweep of human history, and then in terms of the history of just this nation, not that very long ago, it was just an instant ago that we proclaimed emancipation for a subset of human beings that helped to build this society. In 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was made. It promised benefits of citizenship to this fraction of the population that helped to build the agricultural economy of this nation, but it was a false promise because it was not fulfilled. It was in 1870 that the 15th Amendment granted black men the vote. Now, let me stop and emphasize the meaning of that. The country was founded by colonists, and it still bears the feature of a country founded by colonists, appropriating land, wealth, labor for themselves, meaning excluding other people from that land, labor, and profit. Now, we often talk about the values that are embodied in the founding of this nation without recognizing that there were a lot of things left unsettled in that founding, but that one thing was very clear. Those colonists were establishing a colony and a nation for their own benefit. So if you were a white landowning male, you were entitled to a great deal of the benefits of the system that they set in place. So now let's connect with what I just began to recite to you. It has only been through struggle, and a struggle that is far from over, that we're still attempting to make right some of the early architecture of this nation. So let's not idealize the virtues of the nation that we're in by remembering specifically how it was set up. Some of us were not included in the benefits envisioned at that time. So, in 1870, as I mentioned, the 15th Amendment granted black men the vote. It was only in 1920, just stop and think how recently this was historically, that the 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote. Some of you may have seen among the many creative signs on Saturday the one that in more vivid language than I can use here said something along the lines, "I can't believe that I'm still having to march for this stuff." It was only in 1924 that Congress passed the Indian Citizenship Act. It was only in 1965 that there was an effort, at least in language, to undo that unfulfilled promise of the Emancipation Proclamation through the Voting Rights Act, which was intended to reverse Jim Crow laws and the state's claim the individual states had the right to disenfranchise Native Americans. And so the Voting Rights Act was written to try to do away with that. 1965. Now, a lot of these things have been rolled back. In 2013, in the decision known as Shelby County versus Holder, the Voting Rights Act was rolled back because, in the words of the Chief Justice, we had made so much progress that we no longer needed the guarantees of the Voting Rights Act. So this is a struggle. It's an ongoing struggle. And we're in the middle of a moment where we need to redouble efforts if we want to shift the food system. Now let me connect all of this to why the food system embodies all of the things that I just described. So let's talk about your ideas at this moment so that then we can compare them after a while. So here's a list of some important priorities that might have brought us all into this room. So one is to deal with hunger and the epidemic of chronic disease, so health. Another one is local economy, local food systems. Another one is food sovereignty and racial equity in the food system. And another one is climate resilient agricultural systems. So I'm going to ask you to pick one of these. Which one of these would be your priority so that we can get a snapshot? If you had to work on one of these, which would be your priority? And I'll give you just a few seconds to think about that and use your clicker. Okay, so I'm going to give you about 10 seconds and we'll close the poll. And actually, I just realized I disappeared the question, so let me just remind you. Okay. So let's close the poll and let's see whether we can get a readout of where you landed. So it looks like C is the one that has the greatest interest among you. So let's go back and take a look at that. And actually, just to contrast, it looks like B and D were down at the bottom of your list. So let's just take a look at that. We're just going to remark on what those were, and then later on, we'll come to a point where we'll talk about that. So food sovereignty and racial equity. You know, I probably just influenced you with the last 5 minutes. But it looks like a lot of you are interested in local economy and climate resilient agricultural systems. It's an interesting outcome, and let's reserve further comments on this. Just remember that snapshot of this room. Okay, so let's talk about the system that we want to shift. I'm gathering that most of you are in this room because you understand it really well. But let me begin with the very elementary concept of system, because that, it turns out, is going to be a key thing in order for us to be effective in shifting the food system. The food system, I'll underscore that. So, any engineers in the room? There's a small handful. So if we asked these gentlemen what a system was, they would give us some version of something like this, that any system is a set of parts that operate in coordination to produce a specific event or a specific outcome. So the food system conforms to that description. And so let's talk about it just very quickly. The majority of you experience the food system in a setting like this. You get to wish what you want. It can be anything in the world, and it appears for you. Somebody else even cleans up after you. You don't have to worry about whether it's in season, whether it's from the area that you're from. You don't have to worry how it gets prepared. You just get to wish for it. It materializes. You walk away. Somebody else cleans after you. The other way that we experience the food system about half of the time is that we go someplace, we gather the components that we can then assemble in about 5 minutes, at most 20 minutes time at home. And again, we don't have to worry whether that stuff is in season, and most of it is actually specifically prepared so that we can spend just a few minutes and have anything that we want from whatever part of the world that it comes from. Now, one of the purposes of such a system is that it actually is a complex logistical system to make it possible for you to have whatever you want, as much as you want, whenever you want. And the system has been so successful that most of us actually have no consciousness of the fact that that system is behind your plate or behind the restaurant. And actually, we get to think of it as an economic success. To the extent that we ever think about it, we marvel at its efficiency. So any place, so here in Ann Arbor, in the middle of the continent, you can just step a few minutes away from this building and ask for salmon, and you can have your salmon. So this logistical system produces that outcome for you. Now, the thing about this system is that it works really well for some of us. And it actually is the embodiment of a great deal of political and economic power. So if you have sufficient political and economic power, then everything that I've just described is true. Now, each one of us represents different circumstances. So our circumstances are, first of all, who we are, how we're equipped to deal with our circumstances, but those circumstances determine how we experience exactly the same conditions. It is possible for each of us to experience the same set of conditions and have completely different interpretations of those conditions. So that system that I just described, it's out there. It's rapidly becoming the model of the food system around the planet. And yet, if you don't have sufficient economic power, you don't get to participate in that system. At the same time that system is appropriating the land, the labor, the water, the nutrients that are required for everybody else to be able to produce their own food if they don't have sufficient wealth and economic power to participate in this system. So that's an interesting feature of this system. To make it really vivid for you, most of you did not answer that A in the previous list was your priority, but in this country, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, the system does not work for 50 million of us. They cannot access that system with all the features that I just described to you. I'll come back and make an observation about that. But just to make it vivid for you, remember that even in this country, the system operates in the way that I just described, which in other words means it is inequitable. So here's another description of this system. I'm going to use a cartoon for us to summarize the way that this system works. So again, remember everything that I've said. If you have sufficient power and wealth, you can acquire whatever you want. You can make the wealth of the planet, its minerals, its water, its nutrients, the energy embodied in all of that flow to you, converge on you on top of your head. You can have as much of that as you want. So here's a cartoon of the way that this complex logistical system actually operates. And so I want to ask you a question about this. Where do you see farmers here?
Where do you see what?
Farmers. Bottom left, somebody says, where it says agricultural commodities. Now, we could spend a lot of time on this. I will just point out, you don't see farmers. They're not very important in this system for a lot of different reasons. They're basically just inputs to this complex system. The system is this whole thing here. Farmers from all over the world basically contribute to one little corner. As far as the economic system is concerned, they basically are replaceable. So if the corn crop fails in the United States, there's 6 other basins around the world. They're all overproducing. They're all in surplus. They'll get cheap corn to this system, and it continues to hum along just fine. Rice, wheat, all of those, same case. So let's talk about another feature of the system. And again, left, right, whoever noticed that, that's where the farmers would be. This system, as you and I experience it, if we walked into a grocery store, do this computation for Ann Arbor, those of you who are from here, you get access to this side of the food system in a full-service grocery store. If you live in a community with an average income per family of $50,000 per year, for every 10,000 people earning $50,000 a year, there will be a full-service grocery store like this. Now, do this computation for where you are and just sort of verify that for yourself. The reason is that this is a return business model. Very small profit margin, about 1% to 1.5%. It works by getting you to come back every week. You know, they can reliably depend on that, and getting you to buy as much as possible of stuff that you can only eat so much of at any given time. So the whole business model is geared on that. 60,000 products and constant churn, because it's the same stuff, somehow it has to be made to appear new and novel to you so that you keep overeating stuff that you can only eat so much of. And let's talk about the value in this food system. In aggregate, in the United States, its value is 1.8 trillion $1.8 trillion. Now, let me now give you, I'm starting to see some eyes glaze over, so I think I need to give you the punchline of this whole thing so that if you're going to fall asleep, you don't miss that part. So the system shift that I'm going to appeal to involves three major components that need to be shifted. They weren't on any of the charts that we've gone through so far, but they are this. There's a political system, there's an economic system, and there's a cultural system that all are interlocked. They reinforce one another, and that's actually what needs to get shifted in unison. Remember, system is a set of parts that work in coordination to produce a particular outcome. So if we don't like the outcomes that I've just described, and we're just getting started, and we want to shift those outcomes, then the political, economic, and cultural components are the things that we need to be focused on. Now, I started talking here about the economic component, $1.8 trillion. That's $1.8 trillion that says the system is going to stay like it is, because that's a big, powerful economic interest. And I asked you to focus on the farmers in the previous slide, specifically because I wanted to talk about one feature of the system. Farmers, as I mentioned to you, are not that important a part of the system. And when you measure this economically, they get about 17% of the food dollar in the United States. And actually, even this figure is a little bit deceiving. That's an average. So if you're producing products that can get to you as an eater relatively unprocessed, then you tend to earn more than this. So fruits and vegetables, milk, that sort of thing. If there's a lot of processing that needs to go into what you're producing, say corn, soy, wheat, then you may be earning less than 5 cents to the food dollar. So remember that that's an average, but in any case, farmers aren't really that important a part of the system. And so let's get an understanding. I'm going to call in the former Secretary of Agriculture for a little bit of an explanation of the farming population in the United States before we proceed.
I hope that folks would understand the situation of the American farmer. And I don't expect you necessarily to be totally sympathetic, but I want you to know who these people are. You know, for the most part, there are about 2.2, 2.3 million people that are characterized or qualify as farmers under our survey at USDA. It only takes the ability to raise about $1,000 of product for sale to be a quote-unquote farmer. About 1.3 million of that 2.2, 2.3 million are folks who are doing something in the back of their home out in a rural area. They may be growing some strawberries, they may be growing some apples that they turn into cider, and every year they take it down to the farmer's market, and for a couple months they sell a couple $1,000 worth of stuff, and it's a good thing that's taking place. But they're not making any money off this, they're just doing it because they enjoy doing it. So that leaves about 1 million people that we, if you went out and talked to the person on the street, would ask, define for me a family farmer. They're probably talking about these people that do farming, if you will, for a living. Of that number, about 700,000 of that number are small to medium-sized operators who sell less than $250,000 worth of product. In the best times we've had in agriculture, in the last 6 or 7 years, record exports, in some years, record income, these folks averaged about $10,000 from their farming operation. $10,000. Which means that the vast majority of that 700,000 folks, they are working on the farm, they're working off the farm, and their spouse is working on the farm and off the farm. They struggle, but they love the land, they're connected to the land, and they want to stay on the land, and we want to help them. And then you've got the other 200,000 to 300,000 that are commercial-sized operations, and they're doing pretty well.
Okay, now I can be less diplomatic than the Secretary of Agriculture, and let me just summarize this for you. 2.3 million farmers in the country. 1.3 aren't trying to be farmers. They have country land. They have a tax break. 0.7 million are trying to make a living off the farm, but they can't. They net about $10,000 a year, so they have to work off farm in order to get health insurance and to be able to supplement their income. 0.3 million farmers are the farmers that generate more than 75% of the nation's agricultural output. Now, so obviously if you're the Secretary of Agriculture, there's some input in terms of deciding where you're going to invest that department's resources. And he just very casually mentioned at the very end, and then there's about 0.3 million, and they're doing fine. Okay, so let's talk about them. So here you have the percentage of farms in the nation by acreage size along the x-axis here, and then compare that, the percentage of farms in blue, and then the percentage of acres that they manage in green. So let me just summarize the table for you. About 6% of the nation's farmers farm over 50% of the land in the nation. So I'm going to this extent to draw a more accurate picture of the farming population that was instrumental in putting the current administration in power for a very specific reason when we come back and talk about how to reform the political system that's part of the food system. So remember that snapshot of the agricultural population. But now let's talk about the economic system of this nation. You know, there's a very interesting conversation to be had, and this is not the place here, around whether capitalism is even possible. This is not the place to have that conversation. This country is a capitalist nation, so ostensibly we're operating on capitalist principles. But then the question is capitalism working, and if so, for whom? And so this is why we're talking about the political system. Now this may puzzle you because you may say, didn't we just finish talking about the economic aspects of being a farmer, and now we're mixing this up with the political system, and then you're talking about economics again. I'm not getting a whole lot of structure here. So hopefully something like this insight will help. I hope we shall crush in its birth the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations, which dare already to challenge our government to a trial by strength and bid defiance to the laws of our country. Now, this is particularly germane at this moment. Secretary of State, former CEO of Exxon, the presumable Secretary of Labor, fast food CEO. We can go on down the list of the folks that are entering the current administration, and you can see why a statement like this might be germane, but this was actually pronounced by Thomas Jefferson before actually the Declaration of Independence. And so you can see that this was a threat that the founders perceived from the very beginning of the nation, and which we can see was actually a very valid fear. Now, I mentioned to you the size of the food system earlier. Here's a cartoon of a lot of the relationships, a lot of the components of that system. I want to actually talk to you about the way that those components actually produce an outcome for us. So one of the ways that we experience the food system is that you get hungry about 3 times a day. You eat, you do the natural thing when you get hungry. You eat about 3 times a day, and you eat what the food system provides for you. Now, let's connect this to what I said earlier. That system is a system that tries to get you as much as possible of something you can only eat so much of before it makes you sick. But because the more they sell, the more profit they make, that's the business model. How can they get you to sell more? You know the jingles. You can't eat just one. You know, their whole model is to get you to overeat. Now, I'm not casting any judgment on that. I'm just making an objective observation about what drives you in the business model of the food system. But one outcome is that we have a chronic disease epidemic. It's expressed in the following ways. This is an estimate from the CDC, by everyone acknowledged to be an underestimate because this is a very difficult measure to get. But the cost for treating diabetes annually is $245 billion. It's a result of the way in which we eat. The cost for treating obesity, again, just the direct cost, there's all kinds of costs that are secondary that result from being overweight and obese, is annually $190 billion. Again, a result of the way in which we eat. The number 1 killer of Americans is cardiovascular disease. The annual cost of just treating it, not quality of life issues, is $444 billion, again, per year. Now, these are serious numbers, and I have a friend, some of you may have followed him when he wrote for the New York Times, Mark Bittman. He has a particular skill that he can listen to you talk for about 45 minutes, and then he'll say something like this. Oh, what you meant is, and he says one sentence. So he's a great synthesizer, and he did this column, Abundance Doesn't Mean Health. And this is the kicker. It's hard to imagine having a food supply as abundant as ours and doing a worse job with it. So just remark on this for a little bit, and now let me summarize for you the breakdown that I've been talking to you about and maybe put together these various threads of the political system, the economic system, and the social system that needs to be shifted in unison. So ostensibly, if the capitalist system worked, the system that we're embedded in, you all remember this from your introductory economics. You get an environment where producers are free to make their own decisions, consumers are free to make their own decisions, there is transparent access to information, and we compete as producers for those consumers, and the result is that everyone benefits. The consumers benefit because of the fact that producers are competing for the best price point and the best quality, and the winners among the producers are those that are able to provide that best price point and the best quality. So everyone wins. Instead, in the real world, that's the textbook economics. In the real world, the more profit those people make, the sicker we all get. So this is a textbook case of economic breakdown, market breakdown. This is not a melodramatic statement. In the food system, there is no place that the market operates, no place. As a matter of fact, if you remember your economics textbooks, which I hope you did read, you'll notice that the consistent examples of market breakdown are examples out of the agricultural system. It's why it has to be propped up. It's why subsidies are an essential feature, we're made to believe, of the industrial agricultural system. So let's talk about the reform and why the structure is in place that actually requires reform. So going back to this, let's talk about some research. Now I'm going to just describe this very quickly. If you're interested in looking at the actual research, here's the citation at the bottom, and there's some source of information or some lobbying data that I want to get to before I talk to you about the research. So just so that you have an idea, this is the amount of agribusiness lobbying. You know, that $1.8 trillion economic value of the food system, this is what they lobby in order to keep the structure of the system the way that it is. If you want to benchmark this, this is equal to the lobbying that the defense industry does, another one of the most powerful lobbies in DC. Since about 2008, you can say that on average it's been about $140 million a year. So $140 million a year investment for $1.8 trillion of benefits, pocket change for these industries to pool their resources to get the kinds of benefits that they get from the political system reinforcing the non-market economy that actually props them up. The government support is part of their business model. It's not the market operating. And so because they have this kind of power, they can actually hardwire the policies that benefit them to the detriment, as I've said, of all the rest of us. So this is a graph that I'll just walk you through very quickly, but this is a citation that I said that you should go to if you're interested in getting the actual details. Gillens and Page, The Journalist Perspectives in Politics, 2014. So what Gillens and Page did was to take 18 years of data about congressional votes. And what they compiled was nearly 20,000 votes that Congress made. And then they apportioned them to the economic quintile that congressional decisions benefited. And so on this graph, what you see is the probability of policy change up on the vertical axis against the percentage favoring that change. And what you can see is that the more a particular policy benefits the top quintile of the economy in the United States, the more likely Congress is to vote for it. So these social scientists conclude, remember this is just a piece of research, this is not any politicking, but on the basis of those data, they basically conclude that the system of governance in the United States bears no feature of representative government, that is actually a plutocracy, meaning government of the rich for the rich. And we have plenty of evidence in terms of the way that the current administration is being constituted, that's just explicitly the way that it is. So let's talk about the social system now. So I've said a little bit about the political system that reinforces that economic system. So, and what I hope to be doing by referring to these is actually supporting a claim that those are fictions and therefore we can create a different reality. But in terms of the social systems, I have started speaking this evening about some of the very core social struggles that actually make up what this nation is. And before I proceed with this, I want to make something very clear. I'm talking about a set of events that began with the establishing of the nation, and those of us in this room are either descendants of people that established the nation or we are immigrants who came after that. So we're not necessarily bound to decisions and intentions of people that preceded us. We have the liberty of deciding what kind of nation and the world we want for ourselves. So if you see yourselves in any of the snapshots that I'm about to cover, please be clear, I'm not saying that because your ancestors created the features of our society that I'm about to describe, that I or anybody could necessarily make the claim that that reflects on you. So from that, then I want to talk about the way that we have freedom to decide what the future should look like. But we clearly have been unable to decide what kind of a society we want. That's why we have struggle. And so one feature of the political system that we can focus on if we want to shift it, we've seen that it's a plutocracy through such instruments as the Electoral College, which was the founding fathers not really making up their mind that they could actually trust the population to vote directly for their leaders. We could change those things. A representative democracy is one thing. We could change the feature that led to this shameful headline of just a few weeks ago that actually turns democracy upside down. You've heard this statement. We have a system where through gerrymandering of electoral districts, political leaders get to choose their voters rather than voters getting to choose their political leaders. So that's something very concrete that can be changed as well. So the Electoral College system, gerrymandering system, because otherwise, let's talk about some of the outcomes of the rules that we set up to benefit folks that are in power to make decisions, after having illustrated who they are and the fact that that's a constant throughout the history of the nation. Here you see the number of farms with American Indian or Alaska Native operators. These are all USDA data. You see that the Navajo Nation features very big. You can see that Oklahoma, the Five Nations, represents very big. Statistically, Native American farmers and ranchers tend to be cattle producers. Here, let's contrast this to the number of farmers who are, if I can get my remote to work here. Asian operators. And you can see that California features prominently, primarily fruit and vegetable producers, statistically. Contrast this with a number of farms with Black or African American operators. You can see that they feature primarily in the South, and again, statistically, the majority would be cattle producers, statistically. Now, obviously, all of these populations are diverse in terms of what they produce. Here's where you will find the majority of Hispanic or farmers of Latin origin. It has to do with the history of that having been Mexico until 1843, everything that you see highlighted there. And then contrast that with the number of farms where females are the principal operators. They tend to be very prominent in terms of dairy production and in terms of fruit and vegetable production as well. Again, remember, statistically. Now, we went through that very quickly, but now I want to show you where your tax dollars go to support agriculture. So you've seen the geography of all of these different kinds of farmers. Where do you expect all your tax dollars to go? Okay, so we're going to take a look at federal agricultural subsidies. And everything in blue that you see there, if you take a look at this legend, is where you get more than $700 per person. And so you see that it is entirely that Midwestern area, Great Plains area, which was the area that was opened up in the homesteading period, 1862, for the descendants of the colonists who could no longer fit on the eastern seaboard after they had denuded both soil and water and then moved into the Midwest. That's a very polite way of putting it. I'll be less diplomatic in just a little bit. So there's where the dollars are going. So you can see the effect of the structure of the system. So there's no way that planting a CSA is going to do a lot of damage to this kind of structure. It's a more powerful structure that defines the way that the food system operates. So I told you I'd be less polite, and maybe that's not even the way I should have put it. Let's just review a very critical feature of our social structure. So here you see the demographics of this nation. We could spend a lot of time just talking about this, but I just giving you the descriptive statistics. And let's contrast to this, if I can get a very noticeable pattern in terms of the poverty rate. Now, because we are a cash economy, the poverty rate is an almost exact proxy for the hunger rate in the country. So you can see that there's a disproportionate rate of poverty and hunger among the nation's population of color. Now, before I go further with this, let me just tell you that I was reminded of a moment when I was very young this past weekend during the marches in DC. There were a lot of celebrities that came to take part in the marches. One of them was Angela Davis. And when I was a very young man, she came to my school and spoke. And there's one thing that I remember vividly that she just burned into my brain that I want to repeat to you. She said, "I'm going to talk to you about the population of color in this country. And we are not minorities. If you identify as a minority, you believe that you are minor." Now, it's true that we have specific histories and cultures, but we are not minor in any sense in terms of the economy, in terms of the history, in terms of the culture of the nation, and this is what I want to review. The country was enabled by this particular makeup. So let's just go through it very quickly, and you'll see that it is essentially the history of the food system in the United States. So let's begin by, first of all, taking a look at that Homesteading Act that I described, 1862. It was preceded by a methodical effort to displace and eliminate the Native American population of the United States. It began in 1832 with the Indian Removal Act on the eastern seaboard that actually moved those 5 so-called civilized nations from the eastern seaboard to Oklahoma. The Indian Removal Act is not the name of a congressional act that today's Congress would use. You know, they're a lot more sophisticated. But the Congress at that time was very helpful. You know, they named exactly what they wanted to do. So there's no confusion about what the intent of this congressional act was. So they moved the remaining Native American population to an area of the country where they believed they would never ever have an interest in 1832. That concerted effort to displace and eliminate the Native American population took 50 years of concerted government action. It didn't end until the 1880s, late 1880s with the Apache Wars and the massacre at Wounded Knee. Women and children in the middle of the winter doing a ghost dance were massacred by the U.S. Army, last major battle of the Indian Wars. But 50 years of concerted efforts to clear land so that then those folks in the blue part of the chart that I showed you could move in. And I want to quote you something. Here's a record from the Army itself, 200 different battles in that concerted effort to do what I just described to you, systematic official genocide. So I want to quote you something just to drive this home. I taught at Iowa State University for a long number of years, and I taught some of the best people that there are in this country, some of those folks that actually operate these farms, which is why I understand this point. Being a descendant from those folks doesn't mean that you necessarily share the viewpoints of those folks, but this actually has to be confronted. So I can't tell you the number of times that, you know, with an innocent look, you know, a 19, 20-year-old would look at me and say something along these lines. We are so blessed to have this land that we can farm. You know, blessing. Not qualified, I'm not going to bring God into this, I'm not qualified to talk about that. But, you know, in that previous chart of 200 different battles, I know some pretty deliberate things that the government and the colonists of that period of time did in order to get a hold of that area of land. Now, if you talk to an economist about the way in which we can get effective participation and therefore benefits in a cash economy, the one that we live in. Remember I said if you don't have the political or the economic power, you don't get to benefit from that logistical wonder of the food system that I just described. An economist will explain to you rather directly, the way that you succeed in a cash economy, you either control land or you control labor, you control rent. If you have access to any one of those three factors of production, then you can express your entrepreneurship. Or you can trade your labor for income. So there is a formula for inventing poverty, for generating poverty. Wherever you find that you've removed people from their land, and you've alienated people from their labor, and you prevent them from access to rent, so that they can't express their entrepreneurship, you have manufactured poor people. Wherever you go on the surface of the planet, that's the formula for generating poverty. So the Native American people of this nation are some of the most immiserated people on the planet, not just in this nation. You can go to Standing Rock today, you can go to the corners of the Navajo Nation and see this for yourself. And it is a direct result of official government policy. Now, let's talk about another set of the population. You can see that in the case of Native Americans, this history that I just described to you is directly behind the structure of the food system. And here's another component of the food system. This is a characteristic of agriculture from its very beginning. From its very beginning, it has been about stratifying society in such a way that some benefit and others do the drudgery, with all kinds of rationalizations. You know, there's religious, political, ethnic rationalizations for it, but they're rationalizations. So we learn to exploit people and we learn to exploit nature through the practice that today we call agriculture. And so here's just an embodiment of this, a very recent one that was at the core of the birth of this nation. The founders, a great proportion of them were slave owners. And so for a period of about 350 years, there was a systematic trade in human beings, abducted, separated from their families, all the better so that they couldn't really communicate with one another, organize, rise up. They were exploited, brutalized, treated worse than animals. And the key thing is that the labor that was extracted from them was the labor that built this nation from its founding. It was the labor that built the early agricultural economy that was the source of incipient capitalism in the 16th and 17th centuries going on into the early 18th centuries. It's what made this nation rich. Trade first in sugar, trade in tobacco, trade in cotton. All of it fueled by slave labor. The other thing to know about this is that you can bet that plantation owners were not out there producing their food crops, their fruits and vegetables. So that the people at the time of emancipation who were the most knowledgeable about how to turn soil and water and nutrients and entrepreneurship into food were the nation's enslaved people. Now, you can imagine if that entrepreneurial potential at the time of emancipation had been released with the freedom that everybody in this nation was ostensibly entitled to help build the nation under freedom, which is not what happened. This population has been systematically suppressed. You don't need to go very far to see examples of this. So you can't get over things that are not over when you look at the evidence of any given paper, any given day, that shows the systematic suppression of descendants of these former enslaved people. Again, laws sanctioned officially, and this is a direct result of the food system. These people are here because they were required for the colonial food system to operate. Third, there is a saying among the current generation of people that actually have replaced that enslaved labor that says that slavery has only transformed, it hasn't disappeared. Now migrant labor is basically the source of the labor of this country. And one thing that you should know about this labor is that it is managed in a very systematic way. Why do you suppose that there's actually a flow of immigrants to the United States? When you hear about some of the abuses, let me just list you a few of these very quickly. Consistent exposure to some of the most toxic chemicals known to humankind. No labor rights, no overtime compensation, no workman's compensation. It's a laughable proposition that these folks can work for health benefits or they can work for retirement benefits. It's a laughable proposition. Now catch yourself. If in the back of your mind you're saying, well, they're farm laborers, why would they even want that? Just think what that is telling you about how we value that labor and how we think of them as human beings. So you might say to yourself, what is it like where they come from that this is better? And let me just give you one example. The North American Free Trade Agreement is a trade agreement that, again, per capitalist principles, was put into place with the logic something like this. So the United States specializes in agricultural production. Why should Mexico have to worry about producing its own food? Let us produce their food. And the labor that will be liberated from agriculture in Mexico can go into manufacturing clothing and radios for our vehicles, maybe even our vehicles. That was the theory of the North American Free Trade Agreement. Instead, 2 million farmers in central Mexico, southern Mexico, and northern Central America were displaced because they could not compete with North American agriculture under free trade. And that system concentrated them around meat packing plants and fruit and vegetable farms in the United States. So there is a pull and a push involved in this system. And we have leverage over them such that we can pay them, a family of migrants will earn about $10,000 a year. Let me just make a parenthesis. I was once making this point with a different audience, and somebody made the very astute observation. Farmers, you remember what Vilsack said? The majority of farmers, 0.7 million of the farmers in this nation, average $10,000 a year for their family. Well, that's about what a migrant family will make as well with seasonal labor. So we have that leverage because of the fact that in the economic system that we've set up, it doesn't have the currency of the thermodynamic laws of the universe, that are true whether there's a human being here to observe them or not. We make up our economic rules out of thin air. So in the economic system that we've got, what we have set up is a system where materials can move across border. That's what free trade agreements are for. Where capital can move across borders without restriction. That's why, and you make an investment, say, in pineapple growing down in Costa Rica, you're still enriching an owner someplace in New York City. So that's fine per the economic system. But we very deliberately do not let labor move across borders in response to demand, because the demand for that labor is here. That's what creates the leverage so that we can exploit that labor. It's a very intentional feature of the system. So we could go on with this, but you can see that that demographic chart that we saw earlier is not an incidental thing. None of these folks are minor in the history or the culture or the food system of this nation. Without those people, this nation does not exist as we know it today. Without that land, without that labor, this system does not function. And particularly this labor here, you could make the straight-faced argument has infinite value rather than the minimal value that we assign to it. You take these people out of the equation, farms don't work, we don't eat. End of statement. So that's the feature of the food system that we'll just summarize by saying it is inequitable. But here's one other snapshot of that. What you see here is the value of the world's largest grocer here, which I'm showing you just as a proxy for illustrating how, since they decided that they would get into grocery, that there has been a concentration of wealth, not only in the company, but in the family that owns the company. And so let's talk a little bit about that feature, and then I really need to wrap up, and we'll talk about things that we need to do to transform the system Believe me, there are things that we can do. I've already listed a few of them, but we'll come back and summarize them. So let's talk about this feature of the food system. You might say, yes, all of these things are true, but just think about the benefits of this system. I'll remind you, benefits are relative to who you are. But you could make that argument. And so one of the benefits that most people will immediately cite when they talk about the features of the food system is that food is ostensibly cheap. Now, that is objectively not true. The USDA tracks these data. There's a nice set of data that you can find updated annually at the USDA ERS that shows you that the absolute value of food has been increasing consistently ever since they've been tracking. So the absolute cost of food increases. It is very expensive. There is no economy of scale that can rescue the complexity of the logistics of the system that I just described. Yet if you are wealthy, you don't perceive that. And the reason is that you have to notice when you hear champions or advocates for the industrial food system refer to this feature, you have to notice what they're saying. They have to say it in a particular way to fool you into believing what I just stated. And they state it this way. They say, of our disposable income, we spend a smaller proportion than any other country in the world. So that is an important way of stating this, because what it means then is if you are very rich, then it takes very little money of a rich person to be able to cover the phenomenal cost of the industrial food system. So these days, it has come down to about 6% per family. And so let me just illustrate this for you with these data. So let's track income growth in the United States. And so you can see that this is over the past century here. That's what it looks like. The reason why the previous graph showed this decrease in the relative proportion of disposable income is that up until very recently, specifically up until 2011, the rate of personal income growth in the United States had vastly outpaced the increase in the cost of food. So let's take a look at the outcome of doing this, went the opposite direction, hang on, calculation that I just described. I can pretend I was being a good educator and reinforcing the point. So there's what income growth looks like. Now let's take a look at the ratio of these two figures. Your absolute cost of food has essentially been flat over that same period of time, averaging about $5,000 per family. So if you've got $5,000 per family, then you perceive that the cost of food is very cheap to you. So you know that the poverty rate these days is that if you have one child, you earn about $14,000 per year. And remember, there are 50 million people in this country who are poor. I told you I'd come back to this point. $5,000 out of your $14,000 earning, if you earn that, is not 6% of your income. This is why this food system will not work for you. And here's the irony. You are probably the reason why the food system works. You are probably a farm laborer. You are probably working in a restaurant and fast food. You're probably cleaning up in a restaurant, doing dishes. You're probably packing meat. You're essential for the system to work, and you can't participate in the system. So if that's not the definition of exploitation, I'm interested in other versions of this. So let's stop with all of that, and let's just ask you what you think you can do. And here, we did a brainstorm over dinner of some things that we can do. And so let me get you to register what you can do. You can fix the system by your individual purchasing decisions. You can fix this by educating consumers about the system that they're participating in. You can fix this by planting a garden, producing more of your own food. You can fix the system by making yourself well-known and familiar to your government representatives. So think about this for a few seconds, and then enter your answer here. Okay, we'll close the poll in 5 seconds. Okay, let's see what you thought here. Okay, so it looks like A, D, B, and C are the order of what you decided. So let's take a look at them. So the majority of us think that individual purchasing decisions are going to be important. And will somebody who chose A sort of articulate your rationale for that? We know that most of you chose that, yeah.
So if we all stop buying a certain product that we don't think is healthy or good for us, they're going to stop making it.
Okay.
Is that what you imply?
So the demand is basically what will smother the way that the system works. Okay, well, let's talk about this. This is not going to be a complicated argument that I'll make for you. I'll just go back to the very first remarks that I made. A system is a set of parts working in coordination to produce a particular outcome. If you want the different outcome, you need to alter the way that the components work with one another. It's not necessarily about the components. It's the way that the components interact with one another. Now, what I'm showing you here is a placemat from a 2015 Farm Bureau meeting. You see these folks are very direct about what the components of the system are, and then we can make a very good deduction about what the outcome is that they would want out of the system. I'll just run through this very quickly. Remember, this is a placemat. It's not even the business agenda. So it's for the New York Farm Bureau. No new minimum wage increase. No mandatory GMO labeling. No omnibus farm worker labor bill. No movement of animal cruelty laws out of the Department of Agriculture and Markets. No changes to animal care standards that are not based on proven scientific standards. The last one is very parochial to New York City, but the first few give you the flavor, right? So think of these as components of a system with a specific outcome intended. Now imagine what that outcome is, who the beneficiaries are, and who are not the beneficiaries of that system. Because that's actually the theme that I want to elaborate here. We do need to identify the things that we don't want to happen. We need to be very clear about those if we want to define a different outcome. And then we need to come up with alternatives and make those things happen. So let me give you a very simple theory of change here. Again, this is not sophisticated. I don't want you to be expecting a complicated thing. But this is just a very simple way of reasoning about how you change a system with a particular insight that I want to land on. So let's conceive of a present reality. You know, whether any one of those issues that I just mentioned to you were important to you, whether it's menu, labeling, or any of the things that popped out there, think about something that would be better. And so this is what we're envisioning over here to the right. And for any one of those issues, that $1.8 trillion of economic interest in the way that the food system operates right now is saying, no, we're not going to do that. This is more profitable. So we need to identify the things that we really need out of the food system and work for those. So the contrast is the way that the food system is, the things that we don't want in the food system, things that we want to work against, and the things that we want. And the argument that I'm making is that these are all systemic features, that they're outcome of parts. We don't want to focus necessarily on the parts first. We first of all need to focus on the outcomes that we want. So because of the reinforcing nature of the food culture, that some of us actually believe that other people in this country are here for our benefit, that that's our role, and that the economic and political systems reinforce one another, those are really the big things that need transformation. And so there are real solutions, there are false solutions, some of which we've covered here very quickly. This theory of change basically asks us to say, if we want to change this, it has an economic component, it has a social component, it has a political component, and there are things that at any given time may not be politically feasible or economically feasible or socially feasible. And our work then is to make them politically, economically, or socially feasible. That's the work. That's how you can get systems change. And so what we need to do in a situation like this, let me just review for you. We need to remember what is feasible. We need to block out things that are false solutions. Like, for instance, let me give you one false solution. We need to support 0.3 million farmers in the nation to feed the world. This is a cover for the way that the system is actually operating and who it benefits and who it makes poor. We need to identify what we really need, and then we need to work to create the conditions where that can occur. So you want to expose the things that are lies, the things that are false. This means that you need to have political power to deal with the entities that are currently benefiting from that system. I want to talk to you a little bit more about that because that's easier said than done, as you can imagine. And we have to be really creative, and this is key. What we offer up as alternatives can't be poetic, can't be romantic, it has to work. Success will come from coming up with something that really is better than the stuff that exploits people, exploits nature, poisons us, making us sick. So if we believe in the work of transforming the food system, we have to come up with things that are better and actually make us healthy because we get hungry 3 times a day. They're fair and provide thriving wages for everybody that's involved in the food system, that actually build up the natural resources that are required for the food system to operate. We have to highlight those things and actually make them work and demonstrate that they work. And that's what will eventually lead us to reform. So it's a very simplistic theory of change, all of it undergirded by assuming that we can get into a system where the interacting cultural, political, and economic components of our nation can reinforce themselves in a way different from what we've got at the moment. So here's the insight that I told you I wanted to land on. Many of you will not recognize this person. She is sadly no longer with us. She founded the Sustainability Institute. I just want to quote to you a very important insight from her about systems change, and it is this. You can't cleverly find a leverage point to change a system. The most effective way to change a system is to redefine its purpose. If you redefine its purpose, then the system will realign to meet that purpose. You don't need to micromanage the components of the system. So if we can create a society where all the pretty words that we say, whether sitting in church or whether we're meeting with our elected representatives or whether we're teaching civics in school, if those pretty words can actually become reality, then the system should reconfigure in order to meet that. But we really have to contend with the fictions about what this country is constituted to do, who it was created to benefit, who it actually exploits. So if we can come to terms with those sorts of things, easy things, right, then we can actually reform the system that I just described. So in summary, just one proxy for the inequity of the system, here's one transformation that we can do. So that cartoon that I just showed you can be represented this way. Nobody is getting away with anything when I say to you that a small proportion of the food dollar is going to farmers, because remember, the way that you and I experience the food system, it just materializes in front of us. It's as good as the Star Trek replicator. So what it takes to actually get that edible bite, that's an industry term, what it takes to get that edible bite at desire's reach is actually the majority of the value of the food system. That's real value. So if you wanted to redistribute the income in the system in a way that's more equitable, then you need to reimagine the way that that food system works. So a lot of people imagine that schemes like, for instance, a CSA is a romantic notion of a small-scale food system. But it actually has to do with thinking about what you're producing and who is actually going to get the returns from that food system. So it maximizes the return to the farmer, and it gets everybody to share in the risk. You're not partitioning those who benefit from those who suffer the detriments of the food system. Now, because of time, I won't expand this, but you can see that the models of the different kinds of food systems that we have, a regional market system or a food hub, are all basically expansions of that idea. So let me tell you how we're going about reforming this food system, and I'm going to spare you just a few simple lessons here, and I just want to jump directly to our way of putting muscle literally behind this idea. At the Union of Concerned Scientists, we're a very teeny team. We know that we can't do a whole lot of this work ourselves, that we need to partner, that we need to have a lot of allies across the nation, other organizations, the citizenry, and we are proposing that this nation actually needs to define a different outcome for its food system. And we call that a national food policy, where we actually specify that we want a system that's good for people, that's good for nature, that's good for animals, that's humane, all of the benefits that you might imagine that result in healthy people rather than sick people. And so you actually need to have power to do all of the things that I just described, and so you need to build that political power. And our model for doing this, what we're betting on, is that we can go to the actual components of the food system, specifically to all of those that are on the front lines experiencing the way that the food system does not work, assuming that those are the people that are going to have the best ideas about what would be better. Collecting their ideas, working together, coming up with a different vision of the food system, and then putting political muscle by working with people to actually embody that system. Not expecting the government will put it into place, not creating new dependencies, but actually just creating that new system component by component. Producers, laborers, the processing sector, the retail sector, and buyers reinforcing that. So it's not any one of those components. If I had to summarize all of this for you, we need a different outcome. We need to get reinforcing systems working in the, or reinforcing dynamics working throughout the system. And the way that we are doing this is through an actual concerted coalition building effort that's called the HEAL Food Alliance. HEAL stands for Health, Environment, Agriculture, Labor. You can see the website there that you can go to learn a little bit more about the partners in it. So far, 50 different organizations representing those 4 sectors are working together to do the work that I just described. We hope that working together, that system shift that I've described to you will begin to take place. So I've spoken probably about twice as long as I should have, but I'll stop. Have mercy on you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. So we have to end at 8 tonight, so we have time for a couple of quick questions. I just wanted to tie together for 1 second what we heard last week. So Francis Moore-Lappé was here a week ago at this time and gave us some wonderful messages, a lot of inspiring talk about hope, democracy, the need for community and grassroots action. She focused quite a bit on the cognitive and behavioral changes that are needed to engage in those types of action. And I thought you covered such a huge amount of territory, but was a really wonderful complement to that in terms of talking about the structural features that are really needed to get us from here to there and to think about food systems change from a structural and systems perspective. So we would maybe have a lengthy drawn-out discussion, except that we're limited on time. So why don't you handle picking some folks that you'd like to call on? And if we have, I think we have 1 or 2 people with microphones ready to go. So if you can, please keep your question as brief as possible, get right to the point, have a question, and that way hopefully we can get through a couple of them.
Yes, sir.
Do you feel like Hi. Do you feel like there's an example of a small-scale system that's doing the best at pushing the ideas you presented forward?
Yeah, actually, there's a lot. This is not a unique thing. Let me just run down a few quick ones that you can look up on your own. We at UCS are, as I said, operating on a partnership model. So one of our partnerships is with a center that's called the Center for Good Food Purchasing. The premise of the Center for Good Food Purchasing is this. One of the main points of leverage in the food system is institutional purchasing. So schools, hospitals, prisons spend billions of dollars annually in order to purchase food. That money is going to be spent. It's budgeted. So what if you set standards that defined how the food that those institutions bought is actually going to be produced? So the city of Los Angeles actually did this. So they set up what they call the Good Food LA Pledge, and they defined 5 different values that they wanted embodied in the food that they were going to purchase. They said to vendors that were competing for contracts with the city of Los Angeles, selling $1 million or more of food, there are these 5 values, and here are standards that you need to meet for fair prices to farmers, for fair treatment of laborers, for sustainable agriculture practices, for humane treatment of animals, and so on. So they had 5 of these values that they identified, but then identified, here's how you show that you can meet these expectations. They defined it as LEED certification for the food system. So you didn't need to be fully certified in all of the categories. You needed to show that you had a plan to begin to grow into a new way of producing food system. And they leveraged the food system of the greater Los Angeles area, the food shed of that area, And we're very successful, so successful that it was on that model under Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa that a number of different things happened. So for instance, in order to be able to meet the standards set by the city, I forget the number. You will need to check me on this, but I think something like about 168 workers for one of the companies that actually provided trucking, transportation for one of the vendors, went from earning $13 an hour to $19 an hour and gained access to health benefits. Just an example for how this worked. The benefit to the company for granting those benefits to the laborers was that they got access to the contract of the city of Los Angeles so that they could do business with them. So it was so successful that other cities around California began to adopt it. So the Unified School District of San Francisco adopted it. In November, the Unified School District of Oakland adopted it. We're currently working with the city of Chicago. They're the next city that's going to be making an announcement of adoption. In our own backyard in the city of Washington, D.C., Mayor Muriel Bowser just established for the first time a food policy council in the city that is looking at implementing the Good Food Purchasing Plan for the city of D.C. There are 12 cities that have made inquiries to the Center for Good Food Purchasing to learn about the program and implement it. So it's much more detailed, but there's one example. Now, here's another benefit of that program. The wheat that was being grown to manufacture the bread that the city of Los Angeles bought, as you might expect, was being produced in the Dakotas. The lawyer that was running the program asked a very simple question. A lawyer, she didn't pretend to know anything about agriculture. Can Los Angeles or California farmers produce that wheat? And the answer is yes. I'll just cut to the chase. Eventually, a cooperative of farmers and millers and bread makers formed. It's called Shepherd's Grain. You can go look them up online. Now they capture the value of that contract to the city of Los Angeles in the local economy. So they produce the wheat, they mill it, they manufacture the bread, and they manufacture it to the specifications of the city of Los Angeles for low sodium content, for whole grain. And so you can see some of the ways in which this has worked. Another example is they adopted the Meatless Monday program out of Johns Hopkins University, and a program that they called Less Meat, Better Meat, and they were able to make a contract with poultry producers for poultry sold to the city of Los Angeles without using antibiotics. So this is just a very practical market-based way of making actual market dynamics and incentives work to produce greater business returns as well as thriving children in the city of Los Angeles, which is the whole way that this started. Mayor Villaraigosa had pointed out to him that his city had all the features of a third world country, and that the children in the school district were suffering from diabetes, overweight, hypertension, and therefore that was going to affect the economic viability of his city in the future because those citizens couldn't be full-fledged citizens and workers in the future. So yeah, there's all kinds of great stories like that. Look up the story of Good Natured Family Farms in Kansas City, for instance, for another neat example. The food charter in your state is also making a good effort at replicating some of this. The work that Malik operates in Detroit is another really good example about this. It's all about food sovereignty and self-determination. That actually is it's a great story that Malik is better equipped to tell in terms of how it has deep historical roots with identity, but it connects to health and the well-being of the community as well. So yes, there are plenty of examples like that. This is not a difficult thing to put together. If you follow that guiding, that North Star that I described, think about the outcome that you want first, then assemble the system that delivers that outcome. Okay, Jennifer says one more question. Yes, sir.
So my personal experience with small farmers has been one of them kind of dealing with a lot of economic hardship. It's pretty hard to compete in the system that you described at the start of the talk. So I was kind of wondering, you talked a lot about the benefits of that small scale agriculture, CSAs, stuff like that. How do you make it sustainable for the farmers, make that really economically inclusive in this sort of idealized system that you're imagining?
Yeah. Well, I can see why you said idealized system, but I take exception to that because, idealized, that's not a violent statement. I mean, I realize what you're saying is very pretty, but, we live in the real world. because I know lots of farms like that. Now, what it takes for the farm operators that I know that have made a go, and let me just give you a concrete example. I'm thinking of a farmer in the middle of Iowa, you know, the belly of the beast that I described to you, providing income for 2 families on 320 acres. Now, this farmer did it just because he decided, I mean, his motto was, you have to get along, he meant with his neighbors, but you don't have to go along. So, you know, this whole culture that if you're a farmer in Iowa, it means you do corn and beans, or you fatten hogs. He just did not believe that. So he created his own system, a biodiverse system. It created a very rich supply of food for cattle that he fattened, and then he sold his natural fed meat off the farm. That was his economic product. All the stuff that he produced as crops was intermediate product within the farm. It's not complicated economics, and the return for that natural fed beef in the market was such that, I'll repeat, 2 families gained livelihood that was above the average of the income of farmers in his own county, Boone County. So it's not that complicated, really, although I take your premise, but I'll just counter this cultural shift that needs to occur is not buying into the indoctrination about what farming actually ought to look like.
Turn my mic off. On that note, let's thank Dr. Salvador one more time. Hope to see you next week for Raj Patel. Have a good week.